Sometimes the ones who should hold us close are the first to break us. The farmhouse was dim, shadows pooling in corners like spilled ink. Maribel's hands trembled, clutching the frayed edge of her apron. Every heartbeat drummed in her chest, loud enough to drown out the quiet whispers of the room. Her brother, Jonah, loomed in the center of the space, jaw tight, eyes hard as stone. Around him, the townsfolk and distant relatives leaned in, their curious stares piercing her like cold wind. "You're useless, Maribel," Jonah said, each word a sharp cut. "All those years, wasted, I've got debts you're my payment." The words hovered in the air, heavy, unrelenting. Maribel opened her mouth, but no sound came. She searched for a defense, any sign that someone would rise for her. But the room seemed to fold in, suffocating, swallowing her whole. Outside, the wagon waited. Dust swirled at its wheels in the heat, mingling with the murmurs of the onlookers. Some laughed, some shook their heads, some whispered prayers that Maribel could not hear. "You heard him," Jonah added, his voice cold, merciless. "Get in. You ride with the debt collector now. There's nothing left for you here." Maribel felt her knees tremble. The wooden floor seemed to sway beneath her, but she forced herself upright. Pride, fragile and trembling, clung to her. She would not allow him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse entirely. The wagon groaned as she was lifted aboard, skirts catching on the boards. Her hands dug into the rough wood, nails scraping, as she took in the fields she had run through as a child, the orchard where she had hidden from chores, the creek where she had whispered dreams to the sky. And now, all of it disappeared behind a cloud of dust. The crowd's murmurs turned to laughter, a harsh soundtrack to her humiliation. Maribel pressed her hands to her face, cheeks burning, but refused to cry openly. She would endure this, somehow. She had no choice. And then, through the haze of shame, she saw him, a figure standing tall at the edge of the yard. His hat shadowed his face, but his eyes met hers. No mockery, no judgment, just calm, steady observation. A flicker of hope, impossible and delicate, stirred in her chest. The wagon jolted forward. Dust rose like a storm around her, but she held her gaze on the horizon. She clung to the faintest thought. Maybe someone out there saw her worth, even if her own family could not. The farmhouse shrank behind her, swallowed by dust and distance. And in the quiet glance of a silent stranger, Maribel felt the first stirrings of a new journey, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. The wagon rolled on, dust curling in spirals around her boots, carrying her farther from the life she had known, and deeper into a world she had never chosen. Maribel pressed her hands against the sides of the wagon, knuckles white. Each bump of the wheels was a sharp reminder she was alone. Every creak of the boards, every jostle, whispered the truth she could not deny. Her family had abandoned her. The wind tugged at her skirts and hair, flinging strands across her flushed cheeks. She swallowed, tasting dust and sweat, feeling the heat of shame cling like a second skin. She wanted to vanish into the earth, yet she held herself upright, stubborn against the tide of humiliation. And then she saw him again, the tall figure leaning against a distant fence. His hat shadowed a face she could not read, but his eyes were steady, unwavering. No laughter, no scorn, just observation. The strange weight of his gaze pressed gently against her chest, and for a moment the world felt less suffocating. Maribel exhaled slowly, the tiniest spark of something fragile flickering in her chest. Could it be hope? She pushed the thought aside, careful not to believe in illusions, yet the ember lingered, glowing quietly beneath layers of fear and doubt. She thought of Jonah's voice, sharp and merciless. Useless, useless. The repetition haunted her, yet she refused to let it define her. She would not be the girl her brother discarded, not fully. Somewhere inside, beneath every tear and tremor, a small, defiant pulse of self-respect persisted. The wagon rattled over rocks and uneven ground, carrying her into the endless plains. The sun sank lower, painting the horizon in molten gold. Shadows stretched long and thin across the land, swallowing the farmhouse and Jonah behind them. Maribel's eyes followed the horizon, tracing the line where sky met earth. Somewhere along that stretch of dust and wind, perhaps there was a place where she belonged. Perhaps there was someone who could see her as more than what her family had declared her to be. Night fell slowly. The stars emerged, distant and indifferent, as the wagon trundled on through the gathering darkness. Maribel pressed her face against her hands, feeling the cool brush of wind on her skin, tasting the dust in her throat, and letting herself imagine, just for a heartbeat, that this journey might lead to something more than exile. And though her cheeks burned from tears and humiliation, and her heart ached with betrayal, the first flicker of a promise stirred inside her. Perhaps the world was not done with her yet. Perhaps, somewhere ahead, a hand would reach out, steady, strong, and kind. The road ahead was long, rough, and uncertain, yet every step carried the possibility of something she had never dared to imagine: safety, even if fleeting. The wagon rolled slowly over the rugged plains. Dust clung to Maribel's skin, settling in the damp strands of hair that had escaped her braid. Her hands ached from gripping the sides, but she could not let go. Not yet. Every jolt reminded her she was still alive, still moving, still breathing. The cowboy rode beside the wagon, silent and steady. Towering and strong, he seemed a part of the land itself, a shadow against the vast horizon. His presence was quiet but unyielding, a constant she hadn't known she needed. Maribel stole glances at him, unsure if it was fear or curiosity that made her heart beat faster. A loose horse bolted from the brush, eyes wild, hooves pounding the dry earth. Maribel froze, breath caught in her throat. But the cowboy was already there. He grabbed the reins of the runaway animal with effortless strength, guiding it away from the wagon. "Stay low," he murmured, his voice calm, steady. No accusation, no scolding, just certainty. Maribel nodded, swallowing hard. She watched him, noticing how his hands moved, how his eyes scanned the horizon, always alert, always protective. Something in her chest loosened slightly, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. As the day wore on, the sun dipped lower. The cowboy dismounted and approached, carrying a rough wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. The warmth seeped into her chilled skin, a small gesture, yet it felt like a shield against the world's cruelty. Maribel's fingers brushed the coarse fabric. Her lips parted, wanting to thank him, but no words came. It was enough, this quiet acknowledgement that she was not entirely alone. That night, the wagon stopped beneath a canopy of stars. The plains stretched endlessly, dark and serene. Maribel pressed her hands against her knees, feeling the chill of the night wind and the dust that had settled into every crease of her clothing. She thought of her family, of Jonah's words echoing in her mind, useless, useless. The sting remained, but here, under the vast, uncaring sky, it began to lose its grip. Perhaps worth was not something dictated by others. Perhaps it could be claimed quietly in small acts of endurance. The cowboy settled on a nearby ridge, watching over her as she slept. She stole a glance at him, hesitant, unsure if trust could grow in a heart so bruised. Yet something in the way he remained, steady and silent, planted a seed. A quiet notion that maybe, just maybe, she could rely on someone without fear. The plains stretched endless before her, a canvas of dust and wind, and with each mile, Maribel felt the weight of her old life fall further behind. The wagon jostled over rocks and uneven ground. Maribel clung to the edges, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun burned gold and red before slipping into the approaching dusk. Every movement reminded her of her vulnerability, yet with the cowboy riding close, she felt the tiniest thread of protection, an anchor she had not known she needed. Dark clouds gathered with alarming speed, wind tearing across the plains. The first fat drops of rain pelted the wagon, chilling her soaked hands. She shivered, teeth clenched, heart hammering in panic. The cowboy dismounted, his massive form cutting through the wind. Without a word, he shielded her with a heavy canvas, keeping her dry as best he could. The storm raged, but his presence steadied her, a calm center in the chaos. "Hold tight," he said, voice low, carrying over the roar of the wind. "We'll get through this." Maribel nodded, silent, feeling warmth where fear had almost consumed her. It was the first time in days she had felt the possibility of safety, not complete safety, but enough to take a breath without trembling. Hours later, the storm passed. Mud clung to the wagon wheels, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine from a distant ridge. Maribel pressed her palms to her cheeks, feeling rain. Soaked hair cling to her skin, and allowed herself a quiet reflection. Perhaps worth was not what her family had said. Perhaps worth could be measured in survival, in endurance, in small acts of bravery. She had survived humiliation, exile, and the jarring uncertainty of the wagon, and still she drew breath. As darkness fell, the cowboy settled near the wagon, tending a small fire. Maribel watched from the safety of the blanket he had draped over her shoulders. His silhouette against the flickering flames was strong, unyielding, yet gentle in its own quiet way. For the first time, Maribel allowed herself to imagine a possibility she had never dared, that she might not be entirely alone, that someone could see her as more than the useless girl her brother declared her to be. She exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the stars above. The plains were vast and empty, but in the midst of that emptiness, a seed of hope had taken root, a fragile, determined pulse that whispered, perhaps this journey could lead to more than mere survival. The night was calm now, the storm behind them, yet every jolt of the wagon, every rustle of the wind, carried Maribel closer to a truth she had never believed, that safety, trust, and even hope could exist, far from the hands that had once betrayed her. The house stood silent, its windows dark eyes staring across the open fields, and Maribel felt the weight of stillness settle over her like a heavy quilt. The wagon came to a slow halt at the edge of the sprawling ranch. Dust rose in pale clouds and settled onto the worn boards of the porch. Maribel's hands gripped the sides of the wagon, knuckles white, as her heart thudded in her chest. She had traveled far, endured storms and uncertainty, yet the unfamiliar quiet of this place was another kind of challenge. The cowboy, Illy, stepped down first. Tall, solid, steady, he exuded a calm authority that made the vast emptiness feel less daunting. He turned to her, eyes brief and assessing, offering no words, only a presence that said, "Here, you are not entirely alone." Maribel swallowed hard and stepped from the wagon, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth. The air smelled faintly of hay and old wood, and she drew a deep breath, letting the scents anchor her to the present. The front door creaked under her touch, protesting the weight of years and disuse. Inside, the rooms were empty, quiet, yet inviting in their simplicity. Dust motes floated in beams of afternoon light, tracing invisible paths in the still air. Maribel ran a trembling hand along the edge of a table, feeling its rough grain under her fingers. The children, small shadows flitting through the rooms, peeked at her from corners. Their gazes were cautious, curious, yet unthreatening. Maribel offered a tentative smile, unsure if she was allowed to belong here, or anywhere. Illy guided her toward chores without a word. She learned quickly to feed the animals, her hands brushing against rough fur, feathers, and hooves. She mended fences, each nail driven with effort, each board lifted with determination. Her body ached in ways it had not known in years, but the work gave her something she had been denied: purpose. She faltered at first, tripping over the tools, spilling grain. But Ellie's presence was quiet, not scolding, only observant. A nod here, a brief glance there, as if acknowledging her effort without words. It was different from home, where every mistake had been shouted and punished. Here, she felt faintly that she might be allowed to grow. Nights were long and still. The house breathed in silence, and Maribel lay awake on the small bed allotted to her, listening to the wind whisper through cracks in the wood. She traced the edges of her new reality. No sneers, no ridicule, only the steady rhythm of life in a quiet house. She wondered, quietly, if she could ever belong here, if her worth could exist apart from the cruel words of Jonah. Each night, she pressed herself against the coarse blanket, letting exhaustion lull her into a fragile peace, a sense of endurance she had never known. By day, the ranch's vast openness mirrored her growing sense of possibility. Fields stretched endlessly, cattle grazing under a wide, blue sky, birds cutting lines through the air. She moved among the chores with increasing confidence, feeling the rough calluses form on her hands, proof of her labor, proof of her existence. And in the quiet of the house, she began to notice a small truth. She could matter here, even if only in the way she performed each task, each meal prepared, each fence repaired. The silent house held no judgments, no past betrayals, only space for a weary soul to stretch, to breathe, to discover that belonging might not be a gift given, but a truth earned in quiet, patient steps. The quiet of the house was no longer empty. It held a rhythm, a subtle heartbeat of life that Maribel was learning to recognize. Morning light filtered through the windows, painting the dust in golden streaks. Maribel rose, stiff and sore, yet determined. Today, like every day, held chores that demanded her attention, her strength, and her growing resolve. She carried water from the well, the bucket swinging at her side, muscles straining with effort. Each step reminded her that she was capable, that her hands, once thought weak, could sustain life, could nurture and repair. Illy moved beside her, silent but present. He guided her with small gestures, a hand on her shoulder to steady her, a tilt of his head toward the next task. No words of instruction, only the quiet teaching of presence and patience. The children watched from the yard, curiosity softening their caution. Maribel noticed their small smiles, fleeting but genuine, as she fed the chickens and swept the floor. She faltered sometimes, spilled grain, cracked an egg too hard, yet no harsh words came, only the subtle nods of acknowledgement, the faintest approvals that told her she belonged, even in this new, fragile way. At midday, Maribel paused on the porch, wiping sweat from her brow. The vastness of the ranch stretched before her, rolling hills and grazing animals under a sky so wide it seemed infinite. She breathed deeply, letting the wind carry away the shame of her past, the echoes of Jonah's cruel words. She allowed herself a thought she had not dared before. Perhaps she was not useless. Perhaps her hands, her heart, her quiet endurance had value beyond what others had told her. The idea felt strange, delicate, but it warmed her from within, like sunlight on chilled skin. Days passed in rhythm, feeding animals, mending fences, preparing meals. Each task became a statement of presence, a proof of worth. Illy's gaze met hers occasionally, brief and steady, acknowledging her effort without needing words. The children began to follow her instructions, seeking her guidance for small tasks, asking her to show them how to brush the horses' coats or carry feed. Their trust, subtle and growing, became a balm to her bruised spirit. She realized quietly that her persistence, her willingness to endure, was creating its own form of respect. Evenings brought reflection. Maribel sat by the hearth, the fire crackling softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. She traced the patterns of the wood, feeling the weight of exhaustion and accomplishment in equal measure. Here she was needed. Here her labor mattered. Here she was part of a fragile, unfolding world that did not judge her for her past. And in the vast quiet outside, the plains stretched endlessly, open and free. Maribel understood a small truth. She was learning to claim space in the world, not through words or validation, but through steadfast presence and quiet work. The silent house, once intimidating in its emptiness, had begun to hum with life. Maribel, bruised yet unbroken, felt the first tendrils of belonging take root, subtle and unspoken. And somewhere within those walls, the promise of a new life whispered softly, waiting for her to reach for it. Trust was a fragile thing, like sunlight on glass, easily shattered, yet able to warm in ways she had long forgotten. The morning air carried the scent of fresh hay and wildflowers as Maribel stepped onto the porch. She paused, letting the wind tease loose strands of hair across her face. The house was quiet, but not empty. Life stirred in small, unnoticed ways. The soft bleating of lambs, the low murmur of cows, the distant cry of a hawk cutting across the open sky. Illy was already at the barn, moving with measured steps. His shadow stretched long across the ground, steady and unhurried. Maribel watched him, a mix of caution and curiosity fluttering in her chest. She had endured storms, humiliation, and exile. But now she wondered if she could endure something new, companionship without judgment. "Here," Illy said, handing her a bundle of cloth for mending. His voice was low, quiet, yet carried authority in its calm. Maribel took it, fingers brushing against his. A spark of warmth ran through her, quickly suppressed. She nodded, settling onto the porch steps, and began to mend the rips in the fabric. Each stitch became a rhythm, a small act of creation amidst the vastness of the ranch. The children watched, leaning against the fence, curious eyes wide. One of them asked quietly, "How do you do that?" Maribel smiled, tentative but genuine, slowly, carefully, and always pay attention. The lesson was small, yet it carried weight. Their trust in her, subtle and growing, stirred a quiet pride in her chest. For the first time, she felt that her efforts mattered, not because she was told, but because her work earned their respect. Later, in the kitchen, Maribel kneaded dough under Illy's watchful eyes. The scent of baking bread filled the room, comforting and alive. She glanced up, catching him examining the rolling pin in her hands, a faint nod of approval in his eyes. "Looks good," he said almost casually, but his tone held something deeper, an acknowledgement she had never received from anyone who had claimed to love her. Maribel's cheeks flushed. She returned to her work, careful not to let her hands shake. The warmth of the kitchen, the rhythm of the bread, the quiet presence of Illy. It all coalesced into something she had not dared to feel before. Belongings small and fragile, but undeniably real. Evening came soft and gentle. Maribel and Illy worked together to tend the animals, side by side in comfortable silence. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows that intertwined like threads of understanding between them. A lamb had wandered too close to the fence, tangled in loose wire. Maribel froze, unsure how to free it without hurting it. Illy's hand covered hers briefly, guiding her movements. "You've got it," he said quietly, careful and steady. Her heart thudded as she followed his guidance, hands trembling at first, then finding confidence. The lamb was free, bleating softly, and Maribel looked up at Illy. His expression was unreadable, yet there was no judgment, only acknowledgement, respect, and something warmer, something unspoken. And in the fading light, Maribel realized that the walls of the house were no longer silent witnesses to her labor. They were mirrors of the heart, reflecting a bond that grew quietly with each small act, each shared glance, each moment of trust. And somewhere within, her spirit began to flicker with a warmth it had long been denied. The ranch, once a place of silent labor and quiet endurance, now hummed with small, fragile moments that stitched hearts together, thread by invisible thread. Morning light spilled across the kitchen floor. Maribel moved with quiet confidence, preparing breakfast for the children. The aroma of eggs and fresh bread filled the air, a comforting rhythm of routine. Illy watched from the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his gaze steady, approving, yet unspoken. The children gathered, chatter and laughter filling the space, their small hands reaching for plates and cups. Maribel's lips curved into a soft smile, warmth spreading across her chest. She had learned to anticipate their needs, to move with care, and in return, she felt an unfamiliar joy, a longing that was earned, not demanded. A pan tipped slightly, spilling a few eggs onto the floor. The children giggled. Maribel laughed softly, a sound that had been long absent from the ranch, long absent from her life. Illy's lips twitched, almost a smile, but he looked away quickly, pretending indifference. "Clumsy," one of the children teased lightly. "I suppose I am," Maribel admitted, shrugging. "But that's why we have floor scrapers, isn't it?" The children's laughter grew, ringing through the kitchen like a bell. And for the first time, Maribel felt her own laughter join theirs without shame, without apology. Later, in the barn, Maribel helped Illy tend to an injured horse. Her hands were gentle but firm, steadying the animal while Illy administered care. "You've got a touch," Illy murmured, voice low, watching her work. Calm, patient, the horse can feel it. Maribel's heart fluttered, a mix of pride and wonder. No one had ever said that about her. No one had ever acknowledged her ability to bring calm, to bring care, to make a difference. The sun sank low, painting the ranch in deep amber. Maribel and Illy stood side by side, surveying the pastures, checking fences, ensuring the animals were safe. Their silence was comfortable, companionable. No words were needed. The shared labor, the shared responsibility, had built a bridge between them, quiet, steady, unspoken. Her mind wandered briefly to the past, to Jonah, to the humiliation she had endured. And yet, standing here, arms tired, back aching, she realized she had survived more than she had believed possible. She was no longer the girl sold for debt. She was someone who could care, who could protect, who could matter. As the children called from the yard, running to show her a newly mended fence post, Maribel felt warmth spread through her chest. Illy's eyes lingered on her for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition, and she realized the bond between them was no longer distant. It was tangible, it was growing, and it was mutual. The day ended with shadows stretching across the ranch, but inside Maribel, a quiet light had begun to grow. Each shared glance, each small act of care, each moment of trust built a foundation she had never dared to imagine. And though storms still awaited, the warmth of connection offered her a shelter she had never known. Storms do not announce themselves with courtesy. They arrive with fury, demanding courage from those who thought themselves safe. The wind had begun to pick up by mid-afternoon, rattling the shutters and tossing dust into the air. Maribel paused at the edge of the pasture, her hand pressed against the fence. She felt the first cold bite of the storm before the sky darkened completely, clouds swelling and twisting like restless spirits. Illy moved silently beside her, boots sinking into the churned earth. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowed, muscles taut. "We need to bring the animals in," he said, voice low but urgent. Maribel nodded, chest tightening. The ranch she had come to call sanctuary now felt fragile, vulnerable to the wrath of the weather. She moved quickly, gathering feed and calling the sheep, feeling adrenaline surge through her veins. Each command, each movement was a test of her endurance, and she met it head on. Thunder cracked sharp and close. Rain began in heavy sheets, stinging her skin and soaking her hair. The children appeared at the barn's edge, small and frightened, voices trembling with fear. "Stay with me," Maribel called, her voice breaking over the roar of the storm. "Don't leave the barn." She guided them inside, arms wrapped around shivering bodies, feeling the weight of responsibility press on her chest. Every crash of lightning reminded her of the nights she had spent abandoned, humiliated, alone. And yet, here she was, standing firm, refusing to crumble. A fence post snapped under the force of the wind, sending a young calf stumbling toward the creek. Maribel sprinted, heart-pounding, rain lashing her face. She caught the calf by its sides, steadying it with hands slick and aching, mud clinging to her palms. Illy arrived at her side, lifting another fallen post with ease, steadying the structure. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary. Together they worked against the storm, moving as one, an unspoken trust forming in the chaos. The barn doors threatened to blow open, slamming against the walls. Maribel braced herself, muscles straining, and pushed with all her strength. She felt exhaustion prick at her mind, but the sight of the children, died and trusting, kept her moving. Every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every crack of thunder was a challenge, and she met each one with determination she hadn't known she possessed. Later, soaked and trembling, Maribel paused to catch her breath. Her clothes clung to her, mud streaked across her skin, and exhaustion burned through her limbs, but her chest lifted with a quiet triumph. She had faced fear, chaos, and the shadow of inadequacy head-on, and survived. She thought of Jonah, of his cruel words, and realized something fierce inside her. She was not useless, not now, not ever. Her hands, her heart, her courage, they had value, tangible and undeniable. Illy's eyes found hers across the pasture. In that glance there was acknowledgement, recognition, something warmer than respect alone. She met it quietly, her chest still heaving, understanding that the storm had revealed more than her bravery. It had revealed her strength, her endurance, and her unbreakable spirit. The storm raged, relentless and wild, but inside Maribel, a fiercer storm had awakened. Courage, purpose, and a sense of self that could no longer be denied. The wind howled, the rain fell, yet she stood, resolute, ready to face whatever the horizon dared to send next. The night descended in a furious symphony of rain and wind, and Maribel felt the full weight of the storm pressing against every fiber of her being. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ranch in harsh, fleeting flashes. The wind shrieked through broken fences, threatening the animals and tossing debris across the fields. Maribel's hands were raw, her arms aching from hours of effort, yet she refused to step back. The children huddled in the barn, eyes wide with fear, and she could not abandon them. Not now, not ever. A young foal had slipped, legs trembling, mud sucking at its hooves. Maribel waded through the rain, mud up to her knees, and steadied it, whispering soft words to calm its panic. Every flash of lightning, every thunderclap, jarred her resolve, but she held on. Illy appeared at her side, hands gripping the fallen fence rails, voice low but calm. "You've got it. Don't let go." Her grip tightened, heart pounding. She realized then that courage was not the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. As the storm tore across the plains, Maribel's thoughts drifted to Jonah, to the scorn and shame he had piled upon her. The words echoed faintly in her mind, useless, worthless. For a heartbeat, fear threatened to break through again, but this time she did not falter. She met the challenge of the storm, and in that confrontation, she faced the shadow of her past. Her muscles burned, rain soaked through to her bones, yet something fierce and undeniable surged within her. She was not the girl her brother had declared. She was stronger, braver, alive in ways he could never understand. Hours passed, By the time the storm began to relent, the ranch was battered and mud, slick, but the animals were safe. The children emerged from the barn, trembling, yet their trust in her had solidified. Illy approached, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light. He did not speak at first, simply observing her as she wiped mud from her hands and brushed hair from her eyes. Then, with a brief nod, he said, "You've done well, very well." Maribel felt a warmth she could not name, a quiet affirmation that her courage mattered, that her heart had proven its strength. She moved to the edge of the pasture, hands still damp, and looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, revealing stars trembling above the clearing. Each one seemed a testament to survival, endurance, and the quiet power of a will that refused to be broken. The night's chaos had passed, leaving destruction behind, but in Maribel, something far more enduring had been forged. She was no longer defined by humiliation or fear. She was defined by courage, by compassion, by the choices she made when the world demanded everything of her. And as the first light of dawn touched the wet fields, Maribel understood that the storm had revealed her true self, not fragile, not useless, but a woman of undeniable strength, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The town waited in whispers, its narrow streets brimming with judgment, as if the past could hold her forever and bind her worth to old shame. Maribel's boots scuffed against the wooden boards of the town square. Her heart thudded, not from fear of the wind or rain, but from the weight of eyes upon her. Gossip flowed like a river, soft, relentless murmurs questioning her presence, doubting her character. Illy walked at her side, steady and unwavering. His hand brushed hers briefly, not in gesture, but in quiet solidarity. She drew a breath, feeling the surge of courage the storm had awakened within her still pulsing. She would face them. She would not cower. A familiar voice pierced the murmurs. Jonah, her brother, leaned against a post, smirking with smug satisfaction. "Thought you could hide from your past, did you?" His words were sharp, meant to sting. Maribel's jaw tightened. The memory of betrayal, humiliation, and exile threatened to rise, but she held it down, letting only calm authority take its place. "You can say what you like," she said, voice steady. "But your words no longer define me." A few nearby townsfolk scoffed, murmuring behind fans of gossip, yet others paused, uncertain, watching the scene unfold. The balance had shifted. The woman they thought useless now carried herself with undeniable strength. Illy stepped forward, voice firm and unwavering. "She is no one's fool. She is brave. She has proven herself when every storm tried to break her." Maribel felt warmth surge, but she did not rely on it. She would speak for herself, her voice, clear and unwavering, carried across the square. "I have lived through fear, betrayal, and storms you could not imagine, and I am still here. I am not defined by the past, nor by the judgments of those who never dared to face their own." The crowd fell silent. Her words, simple yet resolute, drew attention. Some scoffed still, but others exchanged uncertain glances. The truth of her endurance, her courage, was no longer invisible. Children she had nurtured on the ranch peered from behind posts, timidly stepping forward. Their eyes were bright, trust evident. A neighbor's hand rested on a friend's arm as if to say, "She is not the girl they whispered about anymore." Maribel felt her chest lift. She had never sought revenge, never sought their praise. But now, the acknowledgement of what she had endured and achieved brought a quiet satisfaction, a sense of justice earned in courage, sweat, and steadfast heart. And so, in the heart of a town that had whispered of her shame, Maribel stood, not as the girl sold for debt, not as the one deemed useless, but as a woman whose courage, endurance, and unwavering spirit demanded recognition. And though the trial was only beginning, she knew the truth. Her worth could no longer be denied. The square was still, the wind carrying a tense anticipation, as if the town itself held its breath for what would come next. Maribel stepped forward, every eye fixed upon her. Jonah's smirk faltered under her gaze. The children she had cared for quietly moved closer, their small hands brushing hers, lending courage without words. She lifted her chin and spoke, her voice steady, resonant. I am not defined by what was done to me. I am not worthless. I am the hands that cared for animals in the storm, the arms that held children through fear, the heart that refused to break even when everything tried to crush it. The crowd murmured, some uneasy, others attentive. Her words were simple, yet carried a force that could not be ignored. Every syllable revealed the truth of her life, resilience, bravery, and unwavering moral strength. One by one, those she had touched stepped forward. The children spoke first, voices small but confident. She taught me how to ride without fear. She saved the lamb when it got stuck in the mud. She stayed with us when the storm came. Neighbors nodded, recounting deeds she had done quietly, unclaimed, yet unforgettable. Illy stood beside her, tall and protective, his presence a silent shield. He spoke last, firm and unwavering. She is brave, she is honorable, and she has proven, beyond doubt, that she is stronger than anyone who dared to call her useless. Jonah's face twisted, unable to respond. The words, the witness of those she had helped, struck harder than any argument. The townsfolk shifted, recognition replacing gossip. The moral weight had shifted, tipping in her favor. Maribel's chest lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt fully seen, not as a girl defined by shame, but as a woman defined by courage, compassion, and resilience. She took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. The wind rustled through the square, carrying away whispers and murmurs of judgment. She looked at Illy, at the children, at the neighbors who now regarded her with respect rather than scorn. A quiet, undeniable truth settled in her heart. She had survived. She had faced the past, confronted injustice, and claimed her dignity, not through anger, but through steadfast courage and moral strength. The town had witnessed her endurance, her bravery, her unyielding heart. And in that moment, Maribel knew she had earned what she had long been denied: respect, acknowledgement, and the quiet triumph of a life lived with courage and integrity. The horizon now held not just survival, but a life she could finally claim as her own. The first light of dawn painted the ranch in soft gold, as if the world itself was offering a quiet promise of renewal. Maribel stepped onto the porch, inhaling the crisp morning air. The fields stretched endlessly before her, dew sparkling like scattered diamonds across the grass. A calm settled in her chest, a calm she had never known, earned only through storms, trials, and the quiet forging of courage. Illy was already tending the horses, hands sure and steady. Their eyes met briefly, a shared acknowledgement passing between them. No words were needed. Everything had been said through years of work, trust, and unspoken understanding. Inside the farmhouse, the children bustled about, excited and noisy. Maribel moved among them, laughter spilling from her lips like sunlight through open windows. She guided them in simple tasks, pouring milk, folding cloth, brushing the animals, her movements confident, natural. The warmth of home had grown quietly, a presence that no longer demanded perfection, no longer required hiding. Here, she was valued, cherished, and needed, not because of who she had been told to be, but because of who she had chosen to become. Illy approached her, a loaf of bread in his hand. "You did good," he said softly, voice low but filled with meaning. Maribel's cheeks warmed. "We did good," she replied, glancing at the children, who were eagerly listening, their faces bright with admiration and trust. There was no grandeur, no ceremony, only the quiet affirmation of shared life, of small acts of care that built a home. And in that quiet, a seed of something deeper stirred in Maribel's heart, a sense that love could grow where courage and patience had taken root. She walked to the edge of the fields, the morning light brushing her face. The memories of her past, the humiliation, the betrayal, the storms, rose briefly, but they no longer held power over her. Each challenge she had faced had carved strength into her bones, resilience into her spirit, and now at last she felt whole. The ranch was more than land and buildings. It was sanctuary, family, and home. And in that realization, Maribel allowed herself a moment of quiet joy, the kind that did not depend on approval, the kind that blossomed from her own heart. The morning stretched wide, full of promise, and for the first time Maribel felt the future in her hands, not as a question or a trial, but as a gift waiting to be embraced. The dawn was new, and so was she. The farmhouse hummed softly, alive with laughter, warmth, and the quiet rhythm of a family that had been forged through trials and tenderness alike. Maribel moved through the kitchen, helping the children set the table. Her hands, once considered weak and useless, now guided and nurtured, steady and capable. Every movement carried a confidence born from years of endurance and discovery. Eli stood near the doorway, his tall frame relaxed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He watched her with a quiet admiration that spoke louder than words, a testament to the bond they had forged through storms, labor, and trust. The children gathered around, their eyes bright, holding small flowers they had picked from the morning dew. Maribel knelt to their level, taking the blooms with a gentle smile. "This is for you," one whispered, "for everything you've done for us." Her chest swelled with emotion. She pressed the flowers close, the simple gesture a symbol of love she had never thought herself worthy to receive. The room felt full, complete, and warm in a way that only genuine family can bring. Later, Maribel and Illy stood outside, the horizon stretching wide before them. The sun rose higher, illuminating the fields, the barns, the horses grazing peacefully. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth, a promise of continuity and peace. She turned to him, voice soft yet steady. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere, but, here with you with them, I finally feel like I do." Illy's hand found hers, strong and reassuring. "You belong," he said simply, "and not because anyone told you so, but because you've earned it. Every step, every choice, you've made this life yours." Maribel looked out over the ranch, the sprawling land and the people she now loved. The memories of her past, the ridicule, betrayal, and storms, were still there, shadows on the edge of her vision, but they no longer had dominion over her. They were part of the story, yes, but she had written the ending with courage, love, and unwavering resolve. The children ran through the fields, laughter ringing, Illy's deep chuckle joining theirs. Maribel breathed in deeply, letting the sounds, the warmth, and the light fill her completely. She was not the girl who had been sold for debt. She was a woman of strength, compassion, and love. A woman whose life had been reclaimed, redefined, and illuminated by her own choices. And as the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the ranch, Maribel knew she was home. Her past had shaped her, the storms had tested her, but this morning she embraced a life of her own making, a dawn unbroken, a spirit unshaken, a heart finally at peace.